It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's recording now. And
I don't think,
no, you still have 10
still
minutes.
10 minutes. I don't need to put this on yet.
No. But it's recording now.
Okay, good.
I think, is that okay? I'll go take a shower.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then perhaps I'll go to my mom's and I'll be back before class ends to go to the
Okay.
university.
We'll go to the,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to conclude our discussion of the Ottoman Empire and move on to study India in the early modern period. Before I get started, though, I should note that your first assignment is due, and as I explained previously, this should be uploaded to the appropriate site on UmLearn and also be sent to Naomi Kalnitsky at UManitoba CA. Are there any questions about this? Okay, good. Are there any questions about other aspects of the course or about the content of the lectures? Very good. I'm interested to move on, and I want to start by recalling that last time I spoke about the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and then I noted that there was this slow sinking that occurred across the centuries, and that it expressed itself unevenly in the sense that the Christians, the Greeks, and the Armenian merchants, their position was relatively better than that of the Muslim merchants or the Jews, because the West, which was moving into the Ottoman Empire, I explained how this unequal exchange developed. France and Holland and England began to sort of dominate the economy of the Mediterranean. Well, these powers, which were Christian powers, tended to favor the Christian merchants in the Ottoman Empire, and so things held up better for them. And then I noted that as the economy overall did decline, tensions were exacerbated between the Christians and the Jews. And I told you the story of Sabbatai Sevi. The Jews, in their desperation, the Jews who generally had played down the messianic, the idea that there was a Messiah who would come to deliver them, because that was essentially the story of Christianity. In the 17th century, you have this character, Sabbatai Sevi, who emerges amongst the Jews and claims that he's the Messiah, which I take to be a measure of the desperation of the Jewish population. Now, also the Muslims, as things got worse for them, what you see from a religious point of view is the rise of various kinds of mystical sects amongst the Muslim population. They turn inwards towards religiosity because the external world is unsatisfactory. And one of the sects that did develop, and I want to show this little clip, were the so-called whirling dervishes. Whirling dervishes, extraordinary mystical sect that developed in some of the towns and even amongst the janissaries, the infantry soldiers. They developed this kind of mysticism based on ecstatic dancing or whirling. And this has survived as a kind of tourist attraction. If you go to Istanbul today, you can see this. Here's this clip. It gives you, this is the Sancta Sofia. See, for some reason the sound isn't, but we can see it anyway. I mean, because it's essentially, the performance is essentially visual. These so-called dervishes, and I'll show you how to spell that in a minute.
Sorry.
They work themselves into a kind of mystical trance by whirling around. I guess you could try it in your living room. Okay, now, so we have this overall process of decline going on, but then in the middle of the 17th century, in 1648, to be precise, there comes to the throne a new sultan by the name of Mehmed IV. remember Mehmed II, now we have Mehmed IV. And he embarked, somebody is, okay, Mehmed IV, he, I'm just, yeah, here it is. Mehmed IV, here we have him right here. Mehmed IV undertakes an attempt at reform and renewal of the empire. He's going to try and arrest the process of decline. The way he tries to do this is basically, he says that there has been this corruption of the Ottoman way, and what we need to go do is to go back to the foundational principles of the Ottoman state. And he institutes a widespread purge of the bureaucracy and of the military and of other officials and even of religious figures who are corrupt. And basically he tries to revive the whole structure of the Ottoman state by this widespread purge on the one hand, putting in new moral officials and religious figures, but at the same time, he tries to revive the tradition of jihad. Remember, Mehmed II and Suleiman, they brought the empire into being by essentially crusading for Islam. So the whole idea of crusade as the basis for reviving the elan, the esprit de corps of the Ottoman Empire is adopted by Mehmed IV. Now, I would say that this is not unusual in history, in terms of the history of various empires. Certainly, you see in terms of the Greeks, this happened during the period following Alexander the Great. Particularly, you see this in the Roman Empire and later Byzantine Empire. And you'll see it further in, say, the history of China. There's attempted these restorations of what is essentially a very conservative landlord bureaucratic state. It's a common move. One can say that it can work. It can work. And in the case, as I said last time, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, they could have revived this beast, if you like, this organism, provided that they took certain steps. What they needed to do above all is they needed to reform the military. They had to, in order to keep up with the West, they had to reform the military, and they had to give this whole reform and restoration of the military an economic basis. Now, if we look at Western Europe, we see that essentially many of these still conservative states, like France, after all, was ruled by an absolute monarch and it was a feudal state. Nevertheless, using mercantilism, state-directed economic development, they were able to sort of restore the economic base and on that basis create a modern military. The same thing should have happened in the Ottoman Empire, but no such economic restoration took place in the Ottoman Empire. Instead, we have continuous decline. In fact, they were taxing the common people, the merchants, to death. And so, yes, jihad, yes, the purging of the corrupt elements, but the material foundation for this was quite weak. So you do see that jihad is declared against the infidels, against Europe, and you do see that there is an initial success. The Turks invade the island of Crete. Crete is an island, a big island lying south of Greece. They had long before invaded Rhodes and Cyprus, which were smaller but nevertheless substantial islands in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Turks had taken those during the first part of the 16th century, but now they invade Crete. And after a long war, they seize Crete from the Venetians between 1645 and 1669. This Turkish conquest of Crete takes place. So this is considered to be an initial confirmation of the policy of jihad launched by Mehmed II. But then Mehmed IV's successor decides that he's going to try to actually duplicate the feat of Solomon the Magnificent. That is to say, he's going to invade with a huge Ottoman army and try and capture Vienna. Remember that Solomon the Magnificent tried and failed to conquer Vienna in 1529, way back 150 years earlier, under Charles V. Charles V rallied the Europeans and threw them back. Well, in 1683, the Ottomans try this again. There's a big attempt by a large Ottoman army. And once again, the Habsburgs take the lead in rallying the Europeans to defense. And this time, the Ottomans suffer a catastrophic defeat. In 1683, the European Christian nation, so-called Christian nations, led by the Habsburgs, in this case, it's now the Austrian Habsburgs, they decisively defeat the Ottoman army. And the Ottoman army, made up of Janissaries and Sipari cavalrymen, these traditional military institutions of the Turks, suffer a catastrophic defeat. And why? Because the Austrian Habsburg, along with the other European powers, have completely remolded their armies, made them into what we can call the most advanced, using the most advanced military strategy and tactics, and increasingly modern cannons and rifles and infantry formations. The Turks are simply unable to cope with the European armies. They're outclassed by the technical and logistical progress of the Austrian Habsburgs and the other European states. And this is an ominous development. This defeat in 1683 is an ominous development. It's not only the Austrians who have done this. We also see that in Germany itself, one of the states in Germany, the state of the kingdom now of Prussia, is also modernizing its army and developing an advanced economy using mercantilism to do it, state-directed economic development. So the Habsburgs are doing this, the Prussians are doing this, and now even the Russians, the most, what we say, remote, and you could say backward state on the European continent, are beginning to modernize their army, and they've adopted the principles of mercantilism to do that. Now, I want to point out that states like Russia and Austria and Prussia were in many ways very backward. They were feudal, and most of the peasants were serfs. virtual slaves. Nevertheless, using mercantilism and bringing in sort of military technology, they were able to outclass a state like the Ottoman Empire. So this was an ominous development because now the Habsburgs and the Russians, their territory was next to the Ottoman Empire, contiguous, we could say, next to the Ottoman Empire, which meant that over the next decades, as we move into the 18th century, the Ottomans were faced with an increasing military threat from these expansive European powers. And particularly the Habsburgs faced the Austrian Habsburgs and the Russians as serious military threats with modern armies. Now, the Ottomans, in the face of this, the Sultans tried, because they were not, they certainly knew what the Europeans were doing. And they realized after 1683 that the situation was becoming more serious. The Europeans were encroaching on them. And so you do see in the 18th century, the Sultans, despite the existence of the Janissaries and this so-called Sipahi cavalry, they began to attract certain Western mercenary captains, Westerners who were prepared for money to go to work for the Turks. And they came to Istanbul and they organized based on the principles that these Western military men, mercenaries, learned in England and France and Prussia and so on. They brought these military techniques to Istanbul, and they did organize some modern military units. But what happened? What happened was the Janissary Corps and the Sipahi cavalry, which were institutional parts of the Ottoman state, they became anxious that, in fact, the Sultans meant to liquidate them. And so they staged revolts against the Sultans. And the Sultans were forced to cancel these military units, to disband them. And therefore, they were not able to face the Russians and the Austrians. And as a result of that, in the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire suffers defeat after defeat at the hands of the Austrians and at the hands of the Russians. The Habsburgs were able to take back, let me see if I can find this. 1 second. Yes, well, this is a useful map. The Habsburgs, here is Vienna up here, they reoccupied this whole region, which had basically been either a no man's land or controlled by the Ottomans, all of what you see in purple here, including down into Croatia.
Sorry, Professor.
Can you see it?
Professor, we can't see the map.
You can't see the. You can't see the map. Oh, just a second.
We just see your notes.
Can you see it now? Hello?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Sorry. Yeah, you can see here the areas occupied by the Habsburgs. All of this up here and um, all of this in purple becomes part of the this new center of Habsburg power, the Austrian Empire, right here, right down into basically what is the Northern Balkans, is reoccupied by the Austrian army because um, the Ottomans can't resist. And as for the Russians, maybe I could show this. You see here the areas which the Russians took from the Ottomans. This had been occupied by the under Suleiman the Magnificent. Basically, the Crimea, southern Russia, and a large part of the Ukraine all fell into the hands of the Russians. And by the way, at this point, we can say that whereas earlier, the whole attention of this course, when we came to European history, we were basically speaking about the English, the Dutch, the French, Germany, Spain. Now Russia becomes a real player at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, because of the reforms that I've noted. So the Ottomans suffer serious defeat in the 18th century. And furthermore, to add insult to injury, when the French Revolution comes along, I'm basically now telling you the end of the story, what happens to begin to wind things up. Following the French Revolution in 1789, for reasons I can't go into now, Napoleon invades Egypt, which is, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Sultans can't do anything about it. A French army and fleet arrives in Egypt, and Napoleon, for a couple of years, occupies Egypt until driven out by the British. But the significance of this is that the Europeans are doing whatever they want. They already have essentially economic control of the Ottoman Empire. Now they're openly invading from a military point of view, and this is the beginning of what becomes the European dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. It begins with Napoleon. But to give you the sequel, following that, we have the fact that the Russians, whose power keeps growing, they actually do quite well. They survive the French Revolution and Napoleon and so on, and they are a big power in the early 19th century, and they become the protectors of Greece. Remember, the Greeks are Greek Orthodox. So are the Russians. The Russians are what we call Russian Orthodox, but there's an affinity, a basic affinity. And likewise, Serbia, which was the core state of Yugoslavia, also Orthodox. The Russians now become the benefactors. Well, these are supposedly part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Russians put more and more pressure on the Ottomans to basically give the Greeks and the Serbs their independence. And in the 1820s and the 1830s, Serbia and Greece wins its independence from the Ottoman Empire. So they lose virtually the rest of the Balkans at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, a last thing that I should, in this sort of series of defeats of the Ottomans, the last thing I should mention is what happens in Egypt. And this is quite interesting because in Egypt, it's not so much, well, Napoleon comes and goes, but he plants ideas in the minds of the Egyptians. And one of these characters, he's a military captain. Actually, he was born in Albania, but he was a military captain in the Turkish forces in Egypt. His name was Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali basically he organizes a coup, and Egypt under Muhammad Ali de facto becomes independent of the Ottoman Empire. Muhammad Ali secedes from the Ottoman Empire, takes Egypt out of the Ottoman Empire. And Muhammad Ali was a great innovator. He didn't really touch the religious establishment, but what he did was try to modernize the economy and create a modern army. He began to develop a modern agriculture in Egypt. He began to import manufacturing industries based on the cotton grown in Egypt. He tried to create a textile industry and a whole gamut of other industries. Muhammad Ali, this Muslim leader, attempted to break out of the Ottoman Empire and actually set up what we can call a modernizing state. It certainly was no democracy in any form or shape, but it was the first experiment in modernization in the Islamic world. And so this was a spectacular development. And it worried the English because Egypt was the source of cotton for their mills. And moreover, it was a very important market to them. So what did the English do? They went to the Sultan and they said, well, you can't deal with Muhammad Ali, but we can. And so the Sultan, with the backing of the English, was able to suppress this modernizing movement in Egypt. Now, why do I stress this? But I stress it because it shows that while the West was obviously progressing, we're now in the throes of the Industrial Revolution and so on. They were very careful to block any kind of modernizing movements in third world countries. They regarded it as a threat to their own economies. And this becomes a typical feature of the response of the Western powers, which continues right down to the present. I mean, even this conflict between China and the United States, you can see the United States is trying to block the full emergence of China because from an economic point of view, it threatens the dominance of the United States in the West. Well, this already begins to happen at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's particularly important to underscore this because we have this idea of the Muslim world being hopelessly decadent and so on. Well, here you see with the case of Muhammad Ali that this is not the case. Any questions about or discussion about what I said? Some of what I said is quite controversial, I should say, at least in some eyes. Okay, now I think I've mentioned this point earlier, but it's worth noting. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, we could say, began at the end of the 16th century with the decline of the Mediterranean. But the thing is that in terms of this decline, it certainly took a long time. It wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that the empire finally fell. So it's 5 centuries of decline. And so scholars of the Ottoman Empire say, don't compare the Ottoman Empire with France or England or the United States. Compare it to Italy and Spain. And if you do use that comparison, you see that, yes, the Ottoman Empire declined, but likewise, Spain and Italy declined from the late 16th century as well, because there was a general decline of the Mediterranean. whether it was a Christian country or a Muslim country, the Mediterranean declined, and so Christian countries like Spain and Italy declined. Likewise, Muslim countries. In other words, the decline was independent of culture or religion. Now, I should say, in making my final points about the Ottoman Empire, I should say that there was one in the 19th century. We could note that I'm getting ahead of myself, but how can I just leave the story and not tell you the end of it? In the 1830s, the Sultan actually did institute a comprehensive reform. Remember I said about Mehmed IV and so on, and the inadequacy of the reform. Well, in the 19th century, in the 1830s, the Sultan, he tried to preserve the Ottoman Empire and the rule of the sultans by introducing what was called the Tamenzat, and this was a modernization of the army, of the military. The Janissaries and the Turkish infantry were dissolved. Modern armies were formed. The civil administration was entirely renewed, modernized according to European standards. Civil equality was declared. That is to say, Turks and non-Turks were considered equal before the law, at least in theory. And so, while keeping the Sultanate, there was some attempt to modernize, but it was not sufficient. The Ottoman Empire continued to be victimized in the 19th century by the European powers. The European powers, they dominated militarily and economically, and the Turkish Empire continued to weaken. I would note, for example, that Egypt, the whole of North Africa and Egypt basically became European colonies during the 19th century. Places like Morocco, Algeria, even Egypt was taken over by the British, who finished the Suez Canal, and so on. So the Europeans continued to victimize Turkey. It was only during World War I that a reform movement called the Young Turks developed, and led by an individual by the name of a general, actually, by the name of Ataturk. The Sultanate was overthrown right after the First World War, and Turkey became a republic. And its founding principle was separation of church and state. Very basic European idea, separating religion from politics, was instituted in Turkey. And that is really we could say, Turkey becomes, in a sense, with all of its contradictions, a modern state from the early 20th century onward. Any questions about what I've said? Okay, that concludes what I have to say about the Ottoman Empire. Just let me find my place. Yes, I want to now turn eastward to the briefly to sort of fill out the story, to tell you what happened in Persia, the Persian Empire, which is, of course, essentially Iran, because we're moving eastward and we're moving into India. So you have, of course, the Ottoman Empire here, you have the Persian Empire here, and you have India further east. So I want to look at the Persian Empire briefly. Now, the Ottoman Empire really comes into being in the 16th century. Likewise, a new Persian Empire is created by this dynasty called the Safavid dynasty at the beginning of the 16th century, the same process. So there are two Muslim empires in the middle, formed in the Middle East in the 16th century, the Persian Empire. And this, so the Saffavid dynasty takes over. And the fundamental differentiation between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire is religion. The Ottoman Empire is Sunni Muslim. The Persian Empire is Shiite. And I explained the difference in an earlier lecture. And these two forms of Islam are in fundamental conflict or tension with one another. It parallels the tension between Catholics and Protestants. And this has continued through the centuries. And as you probably know, we see even today that Iran, which is dominated by Shiite clergy, is regarded as fundamentally dangerous by the Sunni states in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia or Egypt. They regard Iran as a sort of a radical religious state that threatens their existence. So this tension between Sunni and Shiite, between the Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, is the most fundamental theme that one could speak about. Having said that, we can say that nevertheless, we do see a common commercial life. Merchants were able to move their goods between these two empires, and a kind of common market existed between them and extended as far as India, because as we're going to see subsequently, India too it constituted itself into an empire at the beginning of the 16th century, and it was Muslim, the so-called Mughal Empire. And so there were actually three great Muslim empires in the Middle East and South Asia in the 16th century: the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Mughal Empire. And the Persian Empire was in the center. And as I said earlier in the term, there was a kind of commercial common market between these different political units, and they had a kind of common culture, common religion, and also they were all ruled essentially by a very privileged landlord class, and including the courts of the rulers were places where there was money to burn. Luxury consumption was the order of the day in all of these. And the Persian Empire was particularly notable for the luxury production. The so-called Persian carpets imitated in the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish carpets, but also silks, glassware, porcelain, fine paintings, a sort of luxury lifestyle which was extraordinary, of course, at the expense of the common people, was a characteristic of, in fact, the Ottomans and the Indian Mughals imitated as much as possible the luxury of the Persian Empire. And I'll leave it at that in terms of a discussion of Persia. I just wanted to mention it because for the sake of completion, I want now to turn to a discussion of India in the early modern period. And I'm going to begin by giving you the background, of course. I'm going to, and the background is there is this extraordinary history to India that I briefly want to review in order to give you some sense of how this sort of Mughal empire was based on this incredible underlay of centuries and centuries of previous civilization. Um, Fundamentally, you have in early modern India this situation where the Muslims are the ruling elite, and they rule over a population which is overwhelmingly Hindu. And the thing is that at the base of Indian society is this complex Hindu civilization that I want to describe for you before I get into the details of what the Mughal Empire, the history of the narrative of the Mughal Empire, in order to sort of give you the underlay, the foundations of the kind of culture and civilization that existed in India during the early modern period. So we first hear of India, the first mentions of India occur in the late 6th and 5th century BC. In the Greek world, obviously we're not studying ancient Greece, but in the Greek world, travelers began to notice at the far ends of what they considered to be they knew the Mediterranean, the civilized world. They heard of this place, this remote place, filled with marvels of all kinds. And from the Persians, they referred to this place as Hind. And from Hind, you get, this is gradually transformed amongst the Greeks and later the Romans into this idea of the India. And even for the Persians, Hind was the end of the world. It was the most remote place that they knew. As I say, so far as the Greeks were concerned, there were people lived there with all kinds of strange customs and manners, filled with marvelous animals and strange events. That was the concept of the Europeans, that India was this strange, exotic, miraculous place. And the truth is that India is extremely different from the West. India today is, of course, a capitalist society. It's a modern place, but even its capitalism today there's a huge difference. Indian culture is hugely different from the West, and I want to try and convey how different it was. To begin with, for example, the Indians historically have had little sense of their own history. As a matter of fact, of course, the Indians have a huge literature. India comes into being around 2600 BC, and the first recorded texts that we have date from around 1600, 1500 BC. We have the first text. But what we see in India is that an enormous corpus of sources, texts that we have, but virtually all of them are religious. There's very little reference in this enormous corpus of sources, historical sources. It's all religious. We don't have any historical or political narratives deriving directly from India. The Indians seem to have been preoccupied by religion from the beginning to the end. There is virtually no sense of India. The furthest we have, or as I said, the Greeks begin to speak a little bit about, in some realistic way, historical way, about India. And the first Greek to write down any sort of historical sense of India is a Greek historian by the name of famous Herodotus in the 5th century BC, has a few pages on Indian history and society. Herodotus is important because he becomes the basis for all the subsequent Greek and Roman accounts of Indian history. They all basically, with some additions, basically use the text of Herodotus for any discussion they have of what India is all about. It's still extremely remote. There are some additional facts that are put in by subsequent historians, but very, very little. So Indian history is a mystery. The situation changes when the Muslims arrive in India. And the Muslims arrive at the beginning of the 8th century AD, 800, between 7 and 800 AD, the Muslims begin to filter into India. They subsequently go on to conquer India in the next 4 centuries, but it begins. And these Muslims actually do begin in a primitive way to record Indian history. That is to say, they mention who the main rulers were, and the main events are, they have Muslim chroniclers who record who the kings, the Muslim kings were, who sent armies into India and so on. They stress the individual kings and their conquests. The history of India begins to be known. I'll pick this up in the next class on Wednesday. Have a good week.